Everybody. Today I wanted to explain why Bitcoin has small blocks. I already did a long video on the fork wars, which kind of touches on all this stuff anyway, but only as part of a big story. And I'd like to just make one video specifically talking about this part of Bitcoin. So the obvious thing when you first come to Bitcoin is, wouldn't it be great if we could all do transactions in Bitcoin as it was initially branded by some of the more artificial thinkers at the beginning as cheap, instant transactions for the world, borderless, global, everything's easy, everything's free, everything's super accessible, anyone can verify anything. Unfortunately, there are trade-offs in this system that weren't well understood by many people, including myself at the beginning. And what this means is when you do a Bitcoin transaction, and when everyone does Bitcoin transactions, no one really trusts transactions that are made on the Bitcoin network until they make it into the Bitcoin blockchain. And Bitcoin's blockchain is a series of blocks, each that have a certain amount of size, and that size determines how much data can go into these blocks. The data is the transactions. And each block being only of a certain size means you can only have a certain amount of transaction data in a block. Now, transactions vary in size depending on the nature of the transaction, but the initial statistic we used to see thrown around all the time was Bitcoin can handle 7 transactions a second, and that's going to be a scaling problem, and that went into the whole fork war drama and all that stuff, and I encourage you to watch that video. But basically, the technical trade-off we had to deal with was this. The bigger we make blocks, and the more space there is for transactions, the cheaper it gets for people to make transactions because there's less competition for block space, and competition is always reflected in the price you pay for transactions. So obviously users for their own short-sighted convenience want blocks to be as big as possible because that means more room for transactions, which means cheaper transactions, which means we can just do whatever we like in the Bitcoin blockchain and it's basically free. Now, no one really acknowledged the trade-off of this, which was, many people did, and that's why blocks remain small. But the trade-off, of course, is this. In Bitcoin, we don't have any trusted third parties. We have to verify everything ourselves. And the more data there is, the harder that gets to do. So the reason we have blocks at the size we do today is because of a sort of happy coincidence where there was an attack going on the Bitcoin network where Satoshi decided to put, at the time, an arbitrary limit on the size of blocks. And that limit is still in place today because we realize if we raise it, we make it impossible for a large enough group of people to easily verify the entire history of the Bitcoin network and therefore maintain its decentralization. The problem with having cheap and fast and easy transactions is that you turn into a very efficient but centralized payment network, and we already have so many of them in existence already that would completely ruin what makes Bitcoin innovative, which is its decentralization. So it was a long and ugly argument, the fork wars, but why we have blocks at the size they are today is sort of a coincidence, but it's a happy one, and it's one of Bitcoin's free miracles, and I'm always alluding to Bitcoin's free miracles on this channel. It wasn't really by design, but it was something that we needed to keep. The benefits of having small blocks, the one disadvantage is what I've already mentioned, which is there's a massive amount of competition for block space, which means doing transactions, at least on the base layer of Bitcoin, becomes increasingly expensive. Everything else with regard to small block is an advantage instead of a disadvantage. Once you lose the fact that, oh, it sucks, I've got to do a Bitcoin transaction, I've got to spend $3 worth of Bitcoin, which, by the way, in a few years will be $30 worth of Bitcoin or $300 worth of Bitcoin. Yes, fair enough. But Bitcoin's blockchain, Bitcoin's ledger, getting data into that it shouldn't be a trivial task because it's the world's most persistent database. It is, if there's ever a way of storing data that you want to continue into the future, it's putting that data in Bitcoin's blockchain, and it's not exactly something that you can reasonably expect without a spoiled attitude to be free and trivial for you to participate in, because that's disrespectful to what it is. It's not designed like that, and it needs to be respected, and there's a good reason for that. So having small blocks means that, well, one thing, there's a whole bunch of things to take into consideration. First off, Bitcoin's deflationary. Miners are currently paid with new Bitcoins every time they find a block, and that halves every 4 years in something called the halving. That's well understood by a lot of people. That's Bitcoin's deflation or inflation schedule, but it is a deflationary currency. Every 4 years it halves. So at the beginning, in the first 4 years of Bitcoin, miners would get 50 new Bitcoins every block. Now that wasn't worth very much money, but at the same time, a sprinkling of transaction fees wasn't really that relevant. It wasn't kept miners going. It was the new Bitcoins they were generating. Then after 4 years, that halved to 25. Then another 4 years, 12.5. Now we're on 6.25. And transaction fees actually are designed to become how we incentivize miners to continue mining in the future, because they're not going to be getting a lot of Bitcoin. Sure, the Bitcoin they're getting is going to be worth a lot more in dollar value, but at the same time, a bigger and bigger percentage or proportion of what they get as a reward for doing the work they do by mining blocks and including transactions in Bitcoin's blockchain, a bigger and bigger part of that is the fact that, pardon me, lost my train of thought. The bigger part of that reward and incentive structure is that they're going to be getting more and more in fees as more people use the network and more people fight to get the data in the blockchain. So right now, fees make up a significant part of what miners make when they mine new blocks. Not right now, because blocks are quite empty at the moment, given all the hectic behavior and massive increase and decrease in hash rate. We've seen a lot of businesses adapt their practices, and now after a couple of years of pretty full blocks, we're seeing some pretty empty blocks again. And I'm filming this on a Saturday night, which is one of the most reliably empty times in the mempool. Nonetheless, in the long run, we do need miners to get paid somehow, and we don't want to end up hard forking to an inflationary system where we have to keep producing new Bitcoins forever to incentivize people to mine. Bitcoin was not designed like that. No one's going to accept that moving of the goalpost, and miners still have to get paid, and they are going to be paid with transaction fees. Now, there are ways around that for you as a user. You can use second layers, and you should use second layers. Not when you're buying houses, but yes, when you're buying coffee. That's the way it's going to work. So there are other reasons why we have small blocks as well, not just to incentivize mining in the long run. Another reason is that Bitcoin it's supposed to be one CPU, one vote. That was the naive description of how mining would work. And in reality, no one actually mines that way. People mine in pools. And the problem with that is if you have the worst scenario you can have is where there's only one pool, because then that pool has complete say over what goes in the blockchain and what doesn't go in the blockchain. And then they become a corruptible central point in the Bitcoin network, and then we're screwed. So the well-known thing is the 51% attack. The minute anyone gets over 50% of the hash rate, then they effectively control the network to, well, at least the network will figure out a way around it, but at the same time, it's still a situation where we're vulnerable. So when pools get large enough, people tend to abandon them, and that mitigates this, but that's not what I'm trying to explain here. What I'm trying to say is that we have mining pools in Bitcoin, and bigger pools can't have too much of an advantage over smaller pools. Right now, if one pool has 40%, another pool has 20%, and another pool has the remaining 40%, they do actually find blocks at roughly the same percentages as the hash power that they have of the total network. That works out about right. Bigger blocks means bigger advantages, or suddenly advantages start to appear to bigger pools, because Bitcoin blocks occur. The network makes it so that the approximate amount of hashes on the network will cumulatively take about 10 minutes to find the next block. If you're a pool and you find a block, you broadcast it to the network, but you instantly start working on a new block. Everyone else, though, they have to download your new block and verify it, and then they start working on the new block. So it's a race that restarts every 10 minutes, but whoever wins one race gets a tiny little head start on everyone else. and especially if people are using good practices like downloading their blocks over Tor and stuff like that. So blocks are 1 megabyte, or I mean they were in the fork wars. They're in practice they're larger than that now because the SegWit soft fork meant there's a bunch of other data that exist. I don't know really what to say about that. I mean, blocks are often on average around 1.9 megabyte now, but there's no the max they can be, I think, is 3.5 megabytes, but they're never really that big. It depends on the nature of the transactions going into the blocks. But nonetheless, if you've got 10 minutes to find a new block, but you've got a 3-second head start, that adds up over time. And the fact that that adds up, that translates into more people are incentivized to mine on the bigger pools, because the bigger pools are disproportionately lucky. If one pool has 20% of the hash rate and another 8 pools only have 10% of the hash rate, the 20% pool in a scenario where blocks are really big and take a good 30 seconds to be downloaded and verified, if that happens, that sucks, because everyone mining on the smaller pools they might make up 10% of the hash rate, but they might only find 9% of the blocks. That's not fair. That means less money, and less money means people abandoning that, because Bitcoin is all about what the incentive structure is, and people are you're supposed to appeal technologically to people's sense of, I want to maximize my amount of income. So that would be a shame. So the fact that this is another thing, like people come along with their improvements to Bitcoin and they say, okay, we're going to make blocks bigger, more transactions, cheaper transactions, and we're going to make blocks faster too. So people do stuff like that. That's what Litecoin came along and said, okay, we're going to make blocks instead of every 10 minutes, they're going to be every 2.5 minutes. And great, I love doing a transaction on the Litecoin network. It's faster, except it isn't really, because all of the trade-offs you're making for that, they're subtle, but they're so stupid. Like in reality, if you want Bitcoin to work more robustly, you want there to be an hour between each block, and you want each block to be as small as possible so that you minimize the advantage that big pools have over small pools. So I think that's, I think I've explained that element of it. And then the other reasons, for not having big blocks were just that they can't be infinitely large. We can't have we can't have everyone's transactions all the time trivially making it into a block, because we can't ever get that big. The bigger you make the blocks, the more disrespectful people treat it. It's like whenever you make any resource more and more available, the more that resource just gets used recklessly. So back in the day when blocks were basically empty, because no one knew about Bitcoin yet, you had Satoshi Dice just spamming the network, just thousands and thousands of transactions. Every block was just Satoshi Dice. And that was just, they don't need to do that. They could have done everything internally, and eventually, this is why blocks are empty at the moment. It's because we've had such drops in hash rate and we've had such big gaps between blocks while we've been waiting for difficulty adjustments that some companies that have just been using abusive and lazy practices and just throwing everything into the blockchain without any good practices, without using SegWit, without using any batching whatsoever. We had huge companies like blockchain.com and Coinbase for years just go, okay, you want to do a Bitcoin withdrawal, here's your Bitcoin. You want to do a deposit, here's a legacy address. All of these, and they would do them one by one. They would just completely bloat the blockchain with no respect for it as a sacred database at all. They would just fill it up with junk. So when we get these turbulent times like we've got at the moment, or recently because of China kicking out all the miners, you have periods where that just gets unrealistically expensive and they had to pull their socks up and actually adopt good practices and use the blockchain more efficiently. That's been really good to see, but the result of that happening is that right now blocks appear mysteriously quite empty. Which is it's quite weird and sobering to see, and it shows you that done properly, we don't need bigger blocks. We just need people to stop being stupid and stop throwing away money. Like you can say, don't waste space in the blockchain, but if you make blocks really big, they're going to do it. This is the problem. If you make blocks huge, people that don't care about decentralization or your ability to run a node, they will just fill it up with junk, and then you'll turn into Ethereum, where it's like, hey, I want to run a node on my Raspberry Pi. I can't, because it's 20 terabytes of data that's going to take me 4 years to download and verify everything, and I'm going to keep crashing along the way. That's not a decentralized network, because the only people that can do it are seriously well-funded and seriously technically accomplished as well. In Bitcoin, you can run a full node somewhat trivially because, thank God, blocks are just about small enough. I personally am in favor of blocks being a little smaller than they are. Unfortunately, going smaller is a soft fork, so we could actually do it. I'm trying to gauge support for making blocks smaller at the moment. I won't pursue this at all within the community if I don't think there is genuine support for it, because I don't want to create any drama needlessly. However, if there is a lot of support for it, I think it's something that should be done. But it's one of those things that people don't get. So people go, oh no, I don't want even smaller blocks. And then we see people talking about Bitcoin being crippled on the base layer. That's something that big blockers like to say. It's not crippled. It's just we're not sacrificing the main principle of it, which is everyone needs to be able to verify this thing. That is actually more important than everyone being able to afford base layer transactions, believe it or not. And it seems exclusionary and it seems discriminatory against the poor. But unfortunately, it's a trade-off. But us small blockers, we acknowledge the trade-off. Of course, we want free and easy transactions for everyone, but there's a problem with that. And now I hope after watching this video, you can understand what that problem is. If you are interested in making blocks smaller, which I am, let me know. And maybe chat and see if there is some talk within the community and see if there is any support for it. A lot of people see the technical merit of it, but just don't want to rock the boat. And if it works, don't fix it. I'm fine with that too. I'm not trying to create any needless drama. And obviously, there is a situation in which Bitcoin does become just strangled because blocks conceivably could be soft forked to be so small that just no one can afford the block space anymore. That could happen, and it could happen maliciously by an actor that's going against community support. So I'm not about to set the precedent of that happening, even though I am a smaller block advocate. I'm not about to write a client or release it into the wild that does it unless I feel like people actually want this thing. So I've got a Twitter poll running at the moment asking, and the majority of people are saying, no, leave the blocks as they are. I think we have infinitely large blocks and we have ridiculously small blocks, and there's a Goldilocks zone. And I think we're a little bit too large, unfortunately. The blockchain is growing currently at about 100 gigabytes a year. That's a little bit unrealistic. That means by the end of the decade, people have way over a terabyte's worth of data to download on their initial block download. Now, is there any evidence that by 2030, internet connections are going to make that trivial and solid state drive read and write speeds are going to be realistically able to do that like much faster than they are currently? I don't see any reason to presume that. I think it's going to make things harder. It's already a bit much. Like 2 years ago, I synced a full node on my Raspberry Pi 4. It took 4 days. Now it takes an extra day. So if we're adding a day for every 2 years, I mean, it starts to get unwieldy quite fast and it starts to get a lot more expensive. Are 2 terabyte hard drives going to be easy and cheaper than 1 terabyte hard drives are today? Maybe. There's a lot to think about, and I'm hoping it's going to be okay. And like I said, Bitcoin does get these free miracles. People will put up with a bit of inconvenience because there's just nothing remotely as good. There's no remote alternative. But anyway, I don't want to ramble on too much. I want this to be a really concise video about why we have small blocks in Bitcoin and these seemingly, anachronistic variables that are set in such a way that people come along and go, oh, that's stupid, we're going to make this bigger and that. Like, you have Elon Musk is the paragon of people that don't understand this, because he went, yeah, let's do what Bitcoin did, but with 100 times cheaper transactions, blocks can be 20 times bigger, and people are like, yeah, mate, all right, we'll do that with rockets, let's make them 50 times bigger, 100 times more people. And like, if you don't understand the actual science of it, you start to look like an idiot, right? So there are limits to what you can do with physics, and there are limits to what you can do in computer science as well. And you're dealing with a decentralized network, so you have to be very careful about maintaining its decentralization. And the famous big block proponents like Roger Ver famously said, if we run the risk of turning into PayPal 2.0, making blocks bigger, it's worth the risk. And these people made statements like that in an accidental spirit of candor, where we could say to them, that's not a risk I want to take. No way. We don't want another centralized payment network because it's a waste of everyone's time. That's not why we're here. We're here for decentralized, uncensorable money. We're not here for cheap transactions, even if we could have all of them, which we can't. We're not here for cheap transactions. When Satoshi said peer-to-peer digital cash, he didn't mean that it's just trivial and cheap to do it. He just meant that it's a bearer instrument, which means if you have Bitcoin, it's like you having cash. No one gets to question the origin of it. It's fungible. No one gets to... all of it's treated equally. I mean, I've already said it's fungible, but the point is, if you have the cash, it's your cash. If it was stolen from someone else, there's no way of someone saying that's not your cash, that's someone else's. That's not how it works. So that's how it works with Bitcoin too. That's why Bitcoin's called digital cash. It's not called digital cash because it's reminiscent of cash in the sense that if you give $10 to someone, it's basically free for you to do that. No, Bitcoin isn't free. Getting data into Bitcoin's blockchain costs money. It should cost money. If you want it to be free, then you're going to end up in a system where you pay through some roundabout mechanism, through submission to some authority figure. And that is, if you think about it, always what happens when you're not using Bitcoin. If you're not submitting to paying for it directly in a financial transaction, you're submitting to it covertly through some sort of submission in another sense, where the transaction is not overt, but you pay for it in some other via some other mechanism. And I encourage you to think about how that would play out. What is it you're paying when you make a cheap friend to family to family PayPal transaction and it's free? Think about how you're actually paying for that, because it's not really free. When Facebook says it's free, is it free? No, it's not. You're just paying with your personal data, and the transaction is obfuscated. It's covert. With a Bitcoin transaction, it's not free either, but at least you pay for it with money, and you pay for it in a way where you understand what you're paying for. And no one is needing to, you're not paying in subtle ways that you don't necessarily understand, and the merchant is laughing at you because you don't really understand the value of what you're handing over. With big data platforms, that's your personal data, by the way. Anyway, that's enough of a tangent for this. I hope that cleared some stuff up. If people want to ask you, why does Bitcoin have small blocks? Lol, it's crippled at the base layer. Please send them this video. This needs to be widely understood. It's a trade-off that's been made intelligently. It's not something that is an unfortunate reality for Bitcoin that shitcoins can come along and tweak. It doesn't work that way. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Peace.